Ici Alexandre, accompagné de mon collègue André Dudomaine. Cette semaine, nous avons un invité, Jesse Wente, qui devrait se rejoindre bientôt avec nous, mais en attendant son arrivée, on pourrait peut-être parler de ce qui s'en vient en présence autochtone ou qu'est-ce qui se passe en ce moment ces temps-ci, André?
Oui, bonjour Alexandre. Effectivement, il y a plein de sujets qu'on pourra aborder. First of all, you have to say that when Jesse will be there, we will switch to English, right? So because Jesse Wente is based in Toronto and his first language is English, and we will have this conversation in the Shakespeare's language. But right now we can speak in French since we are 100% in Montréal. Ouais. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Alors, je voulais souligner, Jesse, il y a quelque chose d'intéressant. C'est en région au Saguenay. Marco Collin, notre ami Marco Collin, va créer une pièce de théâtre, Maclean, Maclean, c'est le livre en Inuit. Et vraiment, c'est intéressant parce que je ne connais pas la pièce, évidemment. Elle va être créée dans quelques jours. Et c'est Louise Portal qui a le rôle principal. Elle joue le rôle d'une Inuit. Et c'est intéressant parce qu'il peut inverser le casting. Les Autochtones dans la pièce vont jouer des rôles de non-autochtones et les non-autochtones, dont Louise Portal, vont jouer des rôles Inuits. Et donc, il y a là quelque chose de fort intéressant, puisque il y a une double inversion. D'abord, le titre, livre, qui réfère à l'écriture, donc à l'alphabet. Et c'est quelque chose à partir d'une langue qui est d'abord orale. Et évidemment, le fait qu'il y a ce casting inversé des acteurs, actrices dans la pièce. Alors, j'ai hâte de voir ce que ça va donner. Mais ça m'amène à une réflexion aussi, qui est celle dans l'article de la presse, qui est très bon d'ailleurs, qui fait le lien. On réfère à Canada avec encore l'idée que ce qu'on avait critiqué, c'est que les interprètes n'étaient pas autochtones. Alors, c'est faux. C'était pas ça la discussion. On parle, au contraire, contre l'appropriation culturelle, on parle de souveraineté narrative. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire que les Autochtones eux-mêmes peuvent raconter leur histoire et il peut avoir associé à ça des gens de toutes les cultures. Le théâtre Ondinoc a fait jouer des rôles d'Autochtones dans ses pièces par des non-autochtones depuis belle lurette et personne s'en est offusqué. L'espace Go, si ma mémoire est bonne, avait monté une pièce de Thompson Highway une truite pour Catherine, qui était montée par André Brassard et jouée par toutes les actrices, parce que toute la distribution était féminine, non autochtone. Personne n'a protesté. Donc, attention, ce qu'on veut et ce qui était reproché à la production Canada telle qu'elle avait été montée, c'était pas que les autochtones, que les acteurs n'étaient pas autochtones, c'était qu'il n'y avait aucune voix autochtone attachée à la conception, à la création, à la réalisation de la pièce. Et c'est tout. Et donc, c'est un faux débat. Et c'est intéressant. J'ai bien hâte de voir comment, quand ce sera montré à Montréal, je suppose que ça va l'être un moment ou à un autre. J'ai beaucoup, beaucoup hâte de voir et d'entendre Marco aussi en parler, qui est un homme de théâtre accompli. Hein. Il n'est pas seulement Wabo à la télévision, il est aussi quelqu'un d'extrêmement créateur et contemporain. Donc, voilà, c'était ça mon ouverture. Et aussi, c'est intéressant parce que Jesse Wente, en question, comme directeur du bureau du cinéma autochtone, le Indigenous Screen Office, et un avocat, et quelqu'un qui a beaucoup plaidé pour la souveraineté narrative, justement. Et c'est de ça dont il est question. Et d'ailleurs, on a entendu récemment Odile Joannette, qui est maintenant attachée au programme autochtone du Conseil des arts du Canada, justement mettre de l'avant la souveraineté narrative, comme elle l'avait fait au Wapikoni, quand elle a été, pendant les années où elle a été directrice générale. Et Jesse Wente, aujourd'hui, est président aussi du conseil d'administration du Conseil des arts du Canada. Donc, c'est là le concept, je pense, qu'il faut retenir, et non celui, c'est pas souveraineté narrative, c'est pas un concept d'exclusion, mais bien un concept de main tendue, de dialogue, mais aussi d'affirmation de soi par les nations autochtones. Voilà, c'était mon éditorial pour aujourd'hui. Et toi, tu voulais parler des langues autochtones et du mois des langues autochtones?
Ben justement, c'est ça. On a commencé l'année avec la décennie des langues autochtones. Puis là, on rentre justement au mois de mars du mois des langues autochtones. Fait que le Conseil de la Nation Atikamekw a lancé un petit défi. En fait, il a encouragé ses locuteurs à dire un mot Atikamekw, un petit mot à chaque jour. Fait que on encourage tous les locuteurs, en fait, de dire un mot dans leur langue à tous les jours. Fait que c'est comme ça qu'on pourrait contribuer à la sauvegarde. Puis en passant, mais juste vous dire que Jesse est avec nous, on va pouvoir l'embarquer. Puis en même temps, tu as fait une belle présentation, une belle introduction de lui. Donc, on va laisser Jesse. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Alors, tu y vas?
Yeah. So if Jesse Wente, we just talk about you. Andre was introducing you in French, but if you could introduce yourself in your own words, what would you say?
I would say I'm Jesse Wente. I'm Anishinaabe from Toronto. My family comes from two places. The settler side of my family comes from Chicago, and the Anishinaabe side comes from Ganabajing, or what is called Serpent River First Nation, of which I am a member. And I'm sure Andre covered my professional life, so I am co-executive director of the Indigenous Screen Office. I am chair of the Canada Council for the Arts.
And also, it's interesting to have you because you just published your memoir a few months ago. Very, very interesting book. And there is a lot to say about it, even in the title, Unreconcealed, Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance. My first reaction was, wow, this guy, my friend Jesse, is so young. It is very early to publish memoir. And I was thinking, what was the drive that bring you to write this retrospective book on your own life and your own journey?
Jesse, est là?
We don't hear. We are not able to hear you.
Can you
That's
hear me
good.
now?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So, in terms of writing the book, I'd been asked to write a book previously, Andre, for many years. You know, I was a columnist on CBC Radio for many, many years, covering cultural issues. I was a film critic for a long time there as well, and so I'd been asked many times, and I honestly turned them all down because I didn't know what I was going to say in a book. And then 2017 happened, and as you remember, 2017 was a year that was somewhat fraught for Indigenous folks, I would say, here in what is currently called Canada, just because it was the sesquicentennial, and there were a lot of things going around and sort of in the public discourse around cultural appropriation, around reconciliation. And I guess I finally decided I did have something to say, and that I could discuss a lot of those issues in relation to my own life and how I've come to understand them through my own experience. And I think anytime you're, we all work with storytellers, film-wise, and I one of the things I've learned is, you tell a story because you hope others will find something in it for themselves, that there's some usefulness to it. And I guess I just thought maybe there might be some usefulness in terms of telling my own story. I think a lot like you, Andre, I've spent most of my professional life trying to help other people tell their stories, trying to make space for their stories, and hadn't totally considered that my story was actually necessarily worth telling, but that changed, and I wrote the book, and it took a long time because, again, I started writing it in 2017, and it was only published, last fall, so that was about 4 years from start to finish. But I did a few other things in between there that might have delayed the writing process, and in the end, it was actually very valuable to the book and to the story I told that it took that time, because there's some stories in there that hadn't occurred yet in my life that I think, especially around my children, that it was very useful that I write the book. Oops, sorry, I have a visitor.
Oh, that's okay. All visitors are welcome in our podcast. The one thing that I found really interesting in your book is, and something that will be very important in all your life, is you make a difference by the fact of being an Anishinaabe and being an Indian. And I would like you to explain to us what is the difference you see between those both way of seeing your identity.
Well, I think, I don't think Indians are real. I think Indians are imagined beings. They are sort of figments of the colonial imagination. I mean, we all know that it's a mislabel from the origins of why we were ever called Indians. And yet, of course, when I think of what people have called me over my life, there was a significant part of my life where that's exactly what they would have described me as an Indian. What's interesting is, of course, my family never would have described us as Indians. My family would have always described us as Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. In joking, I guess, like we all do, when you're on the card table, you might say Indian, or when we're in our communities, or like it's a word we use all the time, but sort of in a joking, familiar way, where it's not because to me, I'm comfortable with the word in that way. And then I've also had the word used against me, I guess is how I would put it. So to me, that's the difference. Like, and then what I realized, Andre, and you know, as folks who spend a lot of time in movie theaters, and I spent a lot of time as a child in movie theaters, we've seen the Indian projected on those screens an awful lot. And I guess what I grapple with or explore in the book, and I think what we all grapple with on some level, is that image, which is the one that most people actually know of us, is the image that was on the screen, the Indian on the screen, versus like that was never what my life was like as an Anishinaabe person. You know, and I describe earlier in the book, I describe this experience I had as a child on the baseball field, where the kids made the war whooping sound, which of course is entirely an invention of that woo woo, that horror. I'm sorry I even made it there, but it's that horrible sound that only exists in Hollywood movies. It's not a sound. You know, I'm now almost I'm a middle-aged man. I've been in Indigenous communities all over the world, let alone my own. Never heard that sound in any one of those places. I guess you could say we weren't at war, so maybe, but I've also been in places where maybe we were almost at war, didn't hear that sound. And I only heard it in movie theaters and on places where non-Indigenous people would use it as an insult, as a way to signify that I'm an Indian to them, and that's how they view me. And so I think, you know, the book, Unreconciled, the title, because I think, you know, that's a title that is meant very purposefully to suggest that politically Canada as a nation is pretty far from being reconciled about most things, quite frankly. But that also personally, there's also a personal reconciliation that I think we all go through, as well as community-based and all of these things. And for me, that is part of the journey, is reconciling those things, that the world sees me as an Indian, but I don't know that Indian that they see me as. That is literally a projection. And the Anishinaabe that I am is the image that I don't see on screen. And if there's a connection to what I've done in my professional life, like so many others, like yourself, Andre, like we've worked really hard to try to get the version of us that we know at home and with our families and our communities to be the version that's on screen, and not the one that I don't know who that is meant to be. It's not us. It's not, and yet we are stuck in a world where that image of us has informed policy and informed has very real world effects on us. And yet we are not part of its creation. And so I've always thought that if we could be part of that, if we were the ones that decided what images, well, then maybe the outcomes we have in the real world that are affected by those things would be different, because people would know us as and not as whatever those figments of this manifest destiny or whatever sort of colonial fairy tale they want to tell. So yeah, that's I mean, that sort of sums up the book, sums up my life's work, sums up what I'll be doing today, tomorrow, and the next day. You know, it's trying to, and I don't like and I get nervous with the word. It's not, because it's not really reconciling those things. It's maybe refining or changing them, because I don't want to reconcile the image of the Indian they have. That's not up for me. That's actually for them to figure out. It's not up for us to, I mean, it's fun to grapple with it in a critical sense or dissect it. It's so boring to me compared to the stuff we do. Like, when I think of the movies that Indigenous people have been able to make, and like, we have not been able to make them really for that long, but if you think of them, they're much more interesting and transformative than a lot of the stuff that I watched as a kid and was taught me in film school. And so I yeah, it's why I'm happy to be here with you, Andre, as someone, a fellow warrior in this work. It's good to share some time with you.
Yes, me and Alexandre too.
Yes, we.
When they ask us what are you doing in life, we say cultural warrior, guerrier culturel. This is and coming back to your book, also there was something that attract my attention is the cultural, the artistic shock, in a sense, you had when a child seeing Star Wars, and the whole story. And we have the same family pattern. We are indigenous by our mother, and they have been denied their own identity because of their marriage with a non-native husband. And of course, it's a situation where we have a lot of questions while growing up about our identity. And in the whole Star Wars saga is about the identity problem of Skywalker. And I was wondering, is Skywalker as something to give us as First Nations?
Oh, it's so interesting. Boy, we could probably do a whole episode just on that question right there, Andre and Alexandra. Yes, like I think of, listen, I think it's not a shock. You know, what is Star Wars? It's the story of rebels fighting against a vast colonial, imperialistic, technologically driven machine that denies humanity, and I mean humanity to be inclusive of Wookiees and all the other aliens in the world in that Star Wars universe, deny them their true selves. So I don't think it's shocking that a lot of Indigenous folks grasp onto that story as like, wow, this is really about us. And we imagine, I think, you know, when I think of how, when that first movie came out in 1977, I saw it in the University Theater on Bloor Street in Toronto. I was 3 years old. It was the first movie I'd ever seen in the theater, and it absolutely changed my life, you know, for sure. And when I think of the ethos of that original film, I think you're bang on. I think when we get into some of the more modern productions out of Star Wars, and I mean more in the 90s and not before we get to this more serialized TV stuff we're seeing today, it feels like maybe the Empire won, if you know what I mean, even internally, in that they seemed very corporate entertainment. You know, a lot of because suddenly Luke becoming a Jedi was about blood quantum and not about kinship, as it would have been in the first movies, because they introduced midichlorians and to me that read as like, well, that's a blood quantum. That's weird that we would, and suddenly it felt colonial in a way that the earlier stories had felt more inclusive of us. Interestingly, I've sort of come full circle in that I'm watching Book of Boba Fett with my children, because they're, you know, I mean, I've still got Star Wars movie posters on my wall. They grew up in my house. It's not a surprise that they'd be interested. But and I have to say, you know, both The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, which are very clearly entirely ripped off of Western, like they're Western films set in space, much like the original, that 1977 film was very much just a Western in space. Curiously, though, the sort of the rebels as the actual heroes, not the Manifest Destiny folks flying the big giant black and white spaceships. I find The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, I mean, I'm halfway through this season of Book of Boba Fett. I mean, if the Sand People or the Tusken Raiders are not us, then I don't know what I'm watching. You know, and I'm for sure understanding that Boba Fett is being played by a Maori guy, you know, and that I can make some of, you know, I think I see what's happening. I think this is the best Star Wars that I've watched since the original, because they've returned to sort of their roots of like, well, these are like a Western, or this Western crossed with a samurai crossed with like West Side Story is sort of like the idea of like Star Wars. And they sort of got back to it. Like they've got a very literal Western setting. It's a lot of Western iconography. I think there was a reason why when it came to The Mandalorian, so many Indigenous people grasped onto Baby Yoda as like, he's ours, because he is. But I would also say, so is The Mandalorian. Who is Baby Yoda in that story but a kid who was scooped? Like the 60s scoop. And who's the Mandalorian but the guy coming to take him home? To bring, and what are our communities all across Turtle Island doing right now, but working really hard to bring our kids home, the kids that never came back, and so yeah, I understand why and boy, I hope they've got, I would not be shocked if they've got Indigenous writers. I hope they do in that room. I know they've got Indigenous folks around Disney, but like, boy, I find a lot of resonance in those stories. Again, I didn't for a while, but suddenly I am again. And I think it's great because my kids, I look at it like my kids and I get to have a conversation about colonialism after watching Star Wars, which is a lot like what the conversations I would have had with my mom after watching Star Wars in the 70s. And that's just a reminder that even pop art can speak to things. And in many ways, it's actually really powerful when it does. Because, my kids are watching Mandalorian. I'm not sure they're getting all this stuff, but we have the conversation afterwards, right? And as a parent, like, that's really interesting to me, to be in that space where we can have those conversations, and where this is something that wasn't necessarily true, because we saw ourselves in Star Wars, but not literally, Andre, right? Like, we sort of had to project ourselves onto Star Wars. In 2022, we're watching Star Wars. I don't have to project. That's literally us on screen. When Boba Fett takes his helmet off, and I see my friend who I've known for many years under the helmet, playing him. That's us. Like, that isn't a projection of us. We are literally in a Star Wars movie now, the hero of it. And that is a difference. And so I think all of that marks, it's interesting you asked that question. That really does, you're so smart. It marks you can mark a lot in that trajectory from 1977 to 2022 and what that has meant for our community. And I'm glad it's back, to be honest. I was sort of upset with Star Wars for a long time there in the middle, but I'm sort of very forgiving of it in the moment right now, because I like what I like the series, interestingly, more than the movies. But anyway, I'm happy to take any of it as it comes, and I can't wait. I think it was so interesting a few years ago to watch Taika Waititi make that Marvel movie, the Thor movie, which was like this big budget, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial movie that I'm not sure Disney understood that that's what they were making. Because, I mean, they're a pretty colonial sort of organization, Disney. But I think, like, when our folks can get their hands on these sorts of stories, there's an opportunity there to shift a whole bunch of people, because theater. And I think that's what's so interesting about a lot of Indigenous cinema right now. If you think of what's happening, like, what are we seeing our people do? They're making science fiction movies. They're making movies where you can enter the theater thinking you're coming for one reason and have a different reason for when you leave. And I think that's always been, to me, the sort of magic of movies, is it's a chance to literally go into a place, sit in the dark, and come out into the light again, and you're not the same. You are different than when you entered that space. And I think of Night Raiders. I think of Slashback, which is just about to debut at South by Southwest, a Nook film, a science fiction alien invasion film set in Nunavut. When I think of Quantum, when I think of Beans, you know, these are movies that exist sort of in a genre paradigm, but are of us in a way that genre movies maybe have never quite grasped. And I think that's a very interesting moment to be in. It's a moment when people will come to Indigenous cinema, maybe not even that being the intention of what they're doing. They're coming because isn't this, hey, it's a zombie movie. Oh, hey, I just watched a zombie movie and learned the entire history of colonialism in Canada. If you're paying attention, you did. I think that's very exciting. And I think that's sort of where we're at. And I think it portends for really great things coming down the road in terms of audience for the stories we're telling.
When I introduced you, I was speaking about narrative sovereignty, which is a very important concept. And I know you are now at the board of the Council of Art, and our friend Odile Joannette is now at the Indigenous program. And Odile, since the Watikoni through the Council of Art, is always speaking about narrative sovereignty. And I would like you to give us the sense of this concept.
Sure. I mean, it's not a concept that I can claim as mine. I think it pre-exists me. Maybe I'm someone who spoke about it a lot in a large forum, so maybe that's why it gets attached to me. But I think it's actually quite simple to understand, even in a Quebec context. I think in my discussion with folks there, they actually get it right away, which is, well, what are the two words? Narrative meaning story or storytelling, sovereignty meaning sovereignty, meaning unto ourselves. And, you know, if you think about, you know, for example, the Canada Council for the Arts, which I'm now chair, you know, that is a narrative sovereignty-based organization, and meaning that when it was founded after the Massey Commission so it was founded in 1957, was given the big endowment. You know, as I'm sure you're well aware, Andre, but maybe your audience isn't, like when it was founded, the Canada Council for the Arts, if you wanted to apply to get a grant as an Indigenous person, as a First Nations person, you had to apply doing a European art form. So anything Indigenous arts was not eligible to be funded by the Canada Council for the Arts. It was considered craft or primitive and thus not a art form in the same way. So if you wanted a grant and you were First Nations, you had to be a ballet dancer, you had to be a concert pianist, you had to be whatever. So, well, let's think about that. Well, then that's an arm of colonialism, right? Like that's saying if you want entry to this space, if you want to be a part of Canadian culture, then you have to participate in what we determine Canadian culture is, which is not whatever Indigenous thing you're doing. Definitely not. You have to do what we say, which is all arts that came from Europe, none of them that necessarily originated here. And so it was a tool. It was one of the many tools, just like residential schools, just like the 60s Scoop, just like the Indian Act, of colonialism, of how colonialism has occurred in Canada. So we fast forward 60 years to 2017, which is when I joined the board of the Canada Council. They had just introduced the Creating, Knowing, and Sharing program, which was designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. It's meant to be administered by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. It's the Odile who now runs it. You know, she reports to the director of programming, reports to the CEO. So in terms of the hierarchy, it's not quite sovereignty in that we don't get to fully decide everything on our own. But inside a crown corporation, which is, you know, a pretty colonial invention, if there ever was one, it's certainly a greater measure of self-determination and sovereignty than we had previously. And then if we transfer to look at the Indigenous Screen Office, which I also run and was the founding director of, it is not dissimilar in terms of its intent. Like it's there to help storytellers tell stories on screen, like film or the Canadian Media Fund or SODEC, any of these organizations that exist, who throughout their histories, if they are honest, and we can certainly be honest in this forum, have not really served Indigenous storytellers, don't really have, up until very recently, have not had Indigenous people on staff there in positions to make decisions around what stories get told and how and who tells them. So the Indigenous Screen Office is sort of, it's entirely run by Indigenous people. It's entirely only for Indigenous storytellers. We have very different approach to criteria and sort of that than Telefilm or CMF. Like, just to give you a quick example, you do not need to have a broadcaster attached to your project to come to the Indigenous Screen Office, because we recognize there are, there's one or two, a growing number of Indigenous broadcasters in Canada, and the traditional broadcasters, the legacy broadcasters, haven't really engaged with our storytellers through their entire history. So why would we make it incumbent for you to tell your story that you've engaged with people who have made it clear that they are not necessarily interested? Doesn't mean we don't want broadcasters to be interested. We do. But I don't want to make our funding, we don't want our funding to be incumbent on you participating in a colonial capitalist system necessarily. So those discussions, there's some other, I love to the show when some other news is announced later this year, Andre, when we can show what the effects narrative sovereignty, when we actually get to decide what that actually means. Because I think it's actually an enormous difference than what we've seen up to very recently in this place, where if we have our own bodies, our own things to help us do this work, and I grant you, like, because I'm always asking at the Indigenous Screen Office, like, how would our people do this, right? And the first thing I always have to acknowledge is probably not this way, like, meaning we didn't have arts councils before Canada existed. Our nations didn't seem it necessary to sort of have like separate, like, if you me, it wasn't how arts and culture we had a very different relationship. It was a part of us in a way that it somehow isn't in colonial society. It's somehow separated from us, because again, in Anishinaabe there really isn't a word for artist in the same way we would have one now. And you wouldn't designate it as like something one person did and someone else didn't do necessarily. So the fact that we have to have an Indigenous Screen Office is sort of representative. Well, we're trying to do this now. We're trying to imagine how we do this now. And so that requires an agency. Like, I can tell you, we've had to negotiate very hard with the government to get as much freedom in our contribution agreement. And we get government funding because, quite frankly, I think it's owed to us that we get that. Because, again, the government forbade us and has prevented us from telling our stories for a very, very long time. Just like when they took my grandmother to residential school, the whole intent was to not just to ensure that she didn't speak her language, but to make sure that I didn't either. And so what is my duty here today? Well, I still struggle to speak my language, to be honest. I'm much better I'm not good in French, but I'm actually better in the other colonial language than I am even in my own. But can I use those languages to negotiate agreements with the government where they don't get to tell us how these things work? They get to fund it, but they don't get to tell us that, because the funding is what's owed, not the direction of how we do it. That's actually owed to us. We get to determine how to do that. And so I know that's a long answer, but I wanted to give an example to how you actually create mechanisms for narrative sovereignty. Even in a colonial system, there's a way there's a way for us to be more self-determined, to frankly, and this is what I argue in my book, and this goes beyond the narrative thing, like the whole key to Canadian sovereignty is our sovereignty. Like that's the magic that's there. Like Canada gets to be sovereign when it recognizes that we are sovereign. That's the key, right? And until it does that, it's going to have crises of legitimacy. That's just true. I would say that's true of Quebec too. Like it's going to be hard for Quebec to be Quebec if it doesn't acknowledge that it exists largely on unceded, untreated land, that other nations have been here for like a very, very long time. And that's sort of like, and so I often, when people talk about like Canadian culture, like, you know, the key to truly unlocking what Canadian culture is, because I'm not sure we've ever actually achieved it, because we've always been missing a central part to the story of this place, which is us. You can't get to Canadian culture if we're not a part of it, because it's my ancestors, just like it's yours, Andre, and yours, Alexandre, who, when the settlers arrived, whenever they came into our territories, our families, they didn't kick them out, right? Like my great grandparents on my mom's side, Alex and Maggie Miyawasaki, they had big dreams for what Canada could be. They didn't sign up for their daughter to be abused in residential school. That's not what they thought was going to happen there. It's their fault. They were actually dreaming of the Canada wishes it could be. And so, and frankly, that's what I'm here. You know, I think what I do every day, it's fighting for that vision of Canada that they had, of a place where we live together, side by side, not one over one another, but side by side. That we could be Anishinaabe and you could be Canadian, and those are things that can exist side by side. We can share this place, that it doesn't have to be this way. And in 2022, I'm still convinced it does not have to be the way it is where we sit now. And so how do I engage in that? Well, I'm a movie geek like you guys. It took me a long time to figure out, well, how do I, as a kid who grew up loving Star Wars and just loves storytelling and like, what do I do to help my community with that set? Because my sister's a lawyer. She has a very, you know, she fights the government in court on a daily basis. Like she has a very clear way of where she can wage war, you know, Andre, to speak to that idea of cultural warriors. My way has been this, to say, okay, then what I want is our stories then. That's what I want. If I can't fight over because I'm not skilled to do the legal stuff. I'm not skilled to do some of this other stuff. I am skilled to come for stories and try to make the space for us here so that we can do it. And so whether that's at the Canada Council, which is, you know, a big thing that is trying, and that's why I would ever agree to be chair there, is that they demonstrated that they understand and they're trying to shift, and so I'm there for that. And likewise, but it maybe wasn't always enough. And so I thought the Indigenous Screen Office was something that also had to exist. And maybe I'm just the right guy in the right place to do that work. And but it is, you know, I think you're right, the two of you, to label it as warrior work, because it's hard. It's not easy, but we do it. And I would also, just to end this very long answer to your very simple question, that narrative sovereignty, if we think of Canada, maintains its grasp on this land. The main way is occupation, of course. The people live here, so that's its main way. I would suggest its second key way is that they tell a story about themselves and being here, and that they do that by investing in their own narrative sovereignty. The country spends billions a year on its narrative sovereignty to maintain that story. So I just think that it should spend, you know, reasonable percentage of those billions to allow us to do the same thing, with the goal, if they're clear-minded about it, with the goal that actually doing that will only strengthen their case, right? Will only further actually help Canadian culture become a thing, become something beyond Tim Hortons and a game we play on ice, or several games we play on ice, that it can become something that is living and breathing, like Anishinaabe culture, which has never rested for 13,000 years. It's still going. From cave paintings to movies, we're still doing it. I think Canadian culture, it's like, if you allow us back, if you allow our stories again to blossom on this place where they've been, where their roots are, if you allow that to happen again, Canadian culture will actually be a much easier thing to discern and to define and to protect, frankly, than it may be sometimes now, where it can be a bit like a butterfly. You're trying to catch it, but you can't quite seize on it. So there's a very long and complex answer to your elegant question.
Before coming back to you, and I will ask you to you jump too fast on the Indigenous Screen Office. We don't know exactly what it is right now.
Okay.
But, before your response, we will have a little intermed for our viewers. Jesse and I, we met the first time on the screen. And the question is, in what film Clint Eastwood, André Dudomaine, and Jesse Wente star together? And the first person who gives the response will get tickets for the opening of the Festival International des Films sur l'Art in the March 24th. And they are opening with an Indigenous film, and I will be there to present. So the response is, in which film Clint Eastwood, André Dudomaine, and Jesse Wente star together? And we are waiting a response, and you have 2 tickets for a beautiful movie night with a premiere of movies. And now let's go back to the Mr. Noel Abel got the response, and we'll get the tickets, of course. So can you speak, what is exactly the Indigenous Screen Office? Is it only a funding body for the Indigenous directors, or what it is exactly?
Yeah, I will try to be shorter in my answer. So the Indigenous Screen Office, it was founded in 2017 as by the Heritage Ministry, the federal government. Mm-hmm. This is after 25-ish years of advocacy by Indigenous storytellers for just such an agency. I like to joke that the advocacy started the day after Screen Australia opened its Indigenous Screen Office, which was 7 years ago or so. So we started right after that. And we are a funding body. In the last federal budget, we were given $40 million over 3 years. Most of that goes through, we have 2 different funding programs. The Story Fund, which is really about funding storytelling. So that's pre-development through to distribution and exhibition and all of that. So full there for films, TV, video games, whatever, as long as it involves a screen, we're good on it. That includes podcasts. That was included on that, as long as they're on a screen. And then the second, what we call the Sector Development Fund, which is really for partnerships. And that's where it's really for professional development and also sectoral growth training. You could come there if you're an organization, say you're an Indigenous producer who wants to become a distributor, we could help you do that, those sorts of things. We are also, though, a little bit more than just a funder. I think it's key in narrative sovereignty that financial decisions also be held within for Indigenous people. But we're also very much an advocacy organization. So, for example, we advocated a lot around Bill C-11, which is the amendments or the new sort of broadcasting act that has been introduced that we hope will pass. We hope become law because it contains some really vital changes around Indigenous broadcasting and storytelling that will support narrative sovereignty for us in the long run. It should, if they pass, it should trigger a whole bunch of new supports. So I came on board as the first founding director in February of 2018. And here we are, 2022. I love to tell this story because this gives you an idea of how things go in Indian country. The first budget I had, Andre, was $235,000 was the annual budget. So that paid for me and my travel for the most part. As I just said, our annual budget this year is going to be right around, I guess, 14 million. So some 5 years later, we're at 14 million. That's about half of where we should be. I think to properly meet the needs of the community, as you, I'm sure, could anticipate, we were oversubscribed to all of our funding programs instantly. So we could use, and we had asked for the full amount. They only gave us a half. So we will go back for the next contribution agreement. But I would say we play those two primary roles, is that we're funding, we help training, professional development, build the capacity, and we're also here to advocate both on the legislative side, but also within the existing funding ecosystem to ensure that Indigenous people have the opportunities to store our way here. And it's what we do every day.
Okay, and we will use you because we just announced that there is a new deadline for the next upcoming Montreal First Peoples Festival for the film Call, and we will send you the links and asking you to spread the news in all your network, which is so important for our not only narrative sovereignty, for our sovereignty, period. And,
yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I would encourage, that's great. We will for sure share that news. We love that festival. And, I would encourage anyone else, if you're an Indigenous filmmaker or TV producer or interested, we've got our website, iso-bea.ca. We do our best to translate into both French and English. All that we do. We just released a report last week that looks at eligibility. Around questions of Indigenous identity and those things when you come to apply. So that's there in both French and English. And I would encourage you, if you have a festival, you have a film that's coming out, let us know. We are happily here to spread the news of all these sort of events happening, and festivals. And you know this, I know better than maybe anyone, Andre, play such an important role for us, and the both as a place to gather, to see each other's work, to share ideas, to collaborate, to create new ideas. I think, and as someone who's worked for film festivals in the past, who's been to film festivals all over the world, and who has not been to a film festival physically in a very long time, it seems far. I have not been in a movie theater. This is the longest I have ever gone in my life between stop movie theater. I cannot wait to be at a festival and to hear the people, and I'll even welcome standing in line.
So maybe we will have the pleasure to have you in August at the Montreal First Peoples Festival. You are always welcome. And speaking of book of memoir, there is also Thompson Highway that just published his own memoir. The title is Permanent Astonishment, if I remember well. And I know that's a good idea to go to CBC website. You have a long interview about joy, how it is important to speak of joy, so that we are people, not people that are always in depression or in the victimology. On the contrary, we have humor, we like life, we like to meet, and we like to laugh. And it is important to tell that story. And I find that Thompson Highway has a better title for his book than you.
Certainly when it comes to joy, you're right about that.
Yeah, exactly. But I would like to hear you about that importance of joys in our own narratives.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. And I love Thompson's book. I mean, I think it's just a fantastic, beautifully written, who would expect otherwise, book. Yeah, I gave that lecture as part on the Ideas program on CBC, so people can find it there if they're interested. And, you know, for me, just joy, because I will tie it back, if I can, to narrative sovereignty. Like, you know, in a system, in the storytelling sort of ecosystem we have in Canada, where it's very state funded, you know, it's not that there haven't been movies by Indigenous people made for a number of years. What I would say is that they're made within a system that can sometimes dictate which Indigenous stories get told and which don't. And so, you know, when we see a lot of tragedy, it's not, of course there's tragedy in lives we're human. And we have been, you know, colonialism landed on us rather heavily. So yeah, there's a lot of tragedy to go forward. But it seems that can sort of be the one story we're allowed to tell, let's put it that way, is that it has to be tragic all the time, that it always has to be sadness. And again, it's not that there isn't sadness in my life, for sure there is. And it was not, but when I think of my family and my community, it's not the sadness is the first thing that comes to mind. It's the opposite of that. The first thing that comes to mind is my aunties playing cards, speaking little snippets of Anishinaabe, I assume the curse words, to each other, and laughing, because euchre was like, and crib, and those games are like blood sports in my family, like for many folks, but they're also like incredible sources of joy and happiness. And, you know, as much as I write in the book about some of the hard things my grandmother had to go through and the impacts of that on my family, what I remember her laugh the most. That's what I remember. I remember her smiling and cooking in the kitchen. I remember the little mints that she used to carry at her purse that would become wrapped in Kleenex, you know, and she would peel off and give me the mint. Like, that's what I remember, not the sad stuff. And I think for our communities, we don't get to depict our joy as often as we actually experience it. And as such, you know, there's a reason why images, like one of the stories I've often told is like the myth of the stoic Indian, right? Like the always serious stoic Indian, you know, comes from Edward Curtis, the photographer, the same Edward Curtis who, when he took those photographs, would tell the subjects not to smile. So they would not smile. If you go look at the photos, those same people would take, but for themselves, when they would go to town and you know, have their photo taken, which was a big thing in like the late 1800s or whatever, they dress in their town clothes. Guess what they're doing in those photos that they would take for themselves? They're smiling. They're not stoic. They're people sitting there having a good time. So like, I think of like, that's all a manufactured thing. Like, that's not us. And so, and I think part of it is, and again, I'm now giving you a long answer to a simple question, but I think in the end, it's like, to be fully human is to be all of those things, is to have tragedy and sadness, but also have love and joy and lust and anger and all of it, the entire human experience on this planet. And when stories are told about us but not by us, we don't get to be fully human. We only get to be the tragic or the stoic or the noble, right? And where our nobility comes from the fact that we're doomed, but we're going to be noble in the face of that, like, or the into with nature or hippie or the whatever. It's when we tell the stories that we get to be all of that. We get to be complex, fully human beings. And when we do that, when we're able to do that for ourselves, that also means others will also begin to understand that we're human. And lo and behold, if people understood we're human, it might be a lot harder to, say, make sports mascots out of us, or to not have drinking water in our communities for like a century and a half, when plumbing has not been a particularly difficult thing to organize for humans for a very long time. Like, there's some things that happen to us where it's like, if our full humanity was simply understood, it would be simply harder for those things to happen to us, I think. And so joy is a part of that. And I also say in that talk that I think part of the issue is our joy is more threatening than our sadness to colonialism. Because the idea that the three of us could go laugh together and have a good time in the midst of colonial ruin is, I actually can understand why that would be seriously threatening to them. Like that, to the idea that like, oh, that's not how this is supposed to turn out. Like, so that's why I want to see, I know, and I hope that over time we'll see that in our cinema, right? Where there will be the romantic comedies and the slapstick and the horror movie, like be all of it, because then that will be the signal that we actually, our presence has been, I don't want to say accepted, because I'm not sure that's a thing colonialism does, but maybe normalized in a way that it hasn't been, where like, that's always been the power to me of like, when we see ourselves and our identities aren't front and center, you know, it's like I remember I'm looking at a photo of me and Graham Greene, who's been a dear friend of mine for a very, very long time. And we once did this event on stage. He asked me once, he said, Jesse, what's your favorite movie of mine? Like, what movie have I made that you love most? And I first said, Die Hard 3. And he would go, what? Like Die Hard 3? And I said, but Graham, you're just in it. Like you're the detective who saves the kids, by the way. If people go watch the movie, like Bruce Willis is off running around Central Park with Sam Jackson. It's Graham Greene who saves the kids from the school in that movie. But it's never identified that he's Indigenous. And this is Graham Greene post Dances with Wolves. Like this is when he is famous for being Indigenous, right? Like he is world famous, Academy Award nominated Graham Greene. And here he is just playing a detective in the story, the hero detective. And to me, that was a very powerful moment, because it's like, he can just be, it's Graham just being awesome at being an actor, which he just is. Like, regardless of where he comes from, he's one of the great actors of our time. And here he is just being a great actor in this giant budget Hollywood movie. And he's being Indigenous because he can't not be, because he's Graham Greene. So, but he's just there being a hero to all the kids, not just Indigenous kids, to all the kids. And boy, like there's a part of me that imagines, there's a great movie coming out made by Zoe Hopkins called Run Woman Run, which is sort of like a comedy. And when I'm seeing that, I'm like, oh yeah, now we're getting to because now we're settling in, where it's like, we'll just make the wacky, because we that too. We don't, oh, I didn't mean to curse. We can do that stuff too. We don't have to always be about tragedy. We can make you laugh. We can make you cry. We can make you love. We can make you lust. We can make you angry. We got all of it. And we can do it with our own stories and our own lives experiences. And I think we're getting there. Like, I think we're, when I see a movie like Run Woman Run, that's a signpost to me. That's like an indicator that stuff is happening, right? Like you and I, Andre, we've been in this business a very long time. We remember the movies we used to see back in the 90s. Those aren't the movies we're seeing in the 2020s. They're very, very different. And I couldn't be more happy. Like it makes all the other stuff, the time spent with senators and politicians that I don't want to spend, if I'm honest, live on this broadcast, but it makes all of that time worth it when I see a movie like that. And I go, look at us just living our lives up on that big screen. Like, because we're awesome. And I think everyone should be invited to also recognize that we're awesome.
Recently, I saw that, and I hear that Alanis Wamsawin, the great Abenaki filmmaker, she is now telling she is optimist for the future of First Nations. And I know Alanis for long, and I know she was not telling that always in her life. But recently she said, yes, there is a step that has been made, and now we will never go back. This progress is there to stay and to go forward in the future. So there is hope for our nations, hope, and with hope we can, of course, speak of joy. And do you have a word for us, Alexandre, for today?
I tried to translate your book, the title of your book, Unreconciled. That's really hard to translate since etymologically, it's really hard to pinpoint the translation in Atikamekw, especially in indigenous languages, because we don't have the same words for each of our language. So I tried. There's a word that I came up with is Teban easy wind. That means separate, but it doesn't necessarily means that is unreconciled. But we see the image that we live apart and we're not talking to each other. But then I went to, you came to talk about a great length about movies. Then why could I just translate these words into different languages? So let me show you what I found. And I have a question for you. Did you try to translate the Indigenous Screen Office into Ojibwe? Your mic is off.
We didn't try Ojibwe, no. I can only imagine the number of vowels that would be involved. We did try Inuktitut, and because it's going to be a challenge. Frankly, it was a challenge even to get it into French. But it won't be easy because I don't think screen is necessarily a word we would have at hand. But that's a good one. I'll have to ask a language. I'll have to ask someone if they can do that at Anishinaabe moment. Yeah.
I think screen will means that movie. That's the idea that we have if we hear screen in the Indigenous Screen Office. So for me, it's easy to translate Indigenous Screen Office. I would say Neuroism is Nashtetjigan Miguam. Office is like the building or the work that we do. So
I love that.
Mm-hmm. But let me show you what I translated for movies, for the word movies. So in Plains Cree, they say Ashikaste Pijigan. this is for movie pictures, photographs. Ojibwe, c'est Mazinatese. It is a movie. In Anishinaabe Mwen, another dialect of Ojibwe, Anishinaabe Mwen, c'est Mazinazgan, which means a camera and a picture. At Kemek Nero Mwen, we say Mizinashte Jijigan. This is the word that we see. Comment on dit ça? Mazinashte. It's like a projection.
Mm.
The thing where we can see.
Mm-hmm. And if we want to talk about camera, we say Mizinazgan. Much more like a Mizinazgan. And in Eastern Cree, James Bay Cree, they say a tikash ta jin. I can't understand what does it mean. And Naskapi no imun, they pretty much like have the same word. Kamatawa pitagnush. Kamamatawi pitagnit. From what I understand, this word it sounds like something that we go in the box, like little characters that live in a box.
In Inuit, it wasn't is it movie theater? When we have the knit, it's usually a place.
Yeah, that's right. So if we say net, that is also something that a place. So we can see also a movie theater in that sense. And in Blackfoot, they say Aisa Kitsisu. I thought I understand it, but now that I read it, I can't see what does it mean. So this is my translation for movies in different indigenous language.
So you have a lot of words to look at now.
Thank you so much for that. I love that.
Yes. Alexandre is one of the person that is fighting for not only the survival but the development and the use of the Atikamekw language. He is a translator and is also, and they have, that's fantastic. We had the podcast about that. And Atikamekw Wikipedia this particular indigenous language, very well alive in the communities right now, and it has to be like that for the future too. So
absolutely,
I thought you have the last word, Jesse.
Oh, wow. Well, I just want to thank both of you for having me on the show and for doing the work that you're doing. I've always been an admirer of yours, Andre, you know that. And Alexandre, sounds like you're doing incredibly important work. So keep it up, both of you. Again, thank you so much. And I'll just echo what Dame Alanis says. I have a lot of hope. And I've been fortunate to know her for a very long time. And understand that she has changed or she sees a different future, and I'm very glad that she still answers my phone calls and spends the time with me, because she's hugely important in my life. And anyway, thank you both so much for having me, and I'm always glad to share some space with some fellow cultural warriors. So, miigwech, chi miigwech for having me.